Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being at our webinar. I am Molly Bloom, the host of Brains On, and I am so happy you're here. So we've been talking a lot this month at Brains On about screens. We're doing something called Analog August. So we're kind of trying to slow our scroll, reset our relationship with our phones. You know, phones are an excellent tool, but, you know, a lot of us maybe use them. I shouldn't say a lot of us. I should only speak for myself. I use my phone too much. A little sick of it. I'm ready to take a break. So if you want more about Analog August, you can just go to brainson.org and you'll see the Analog August box there. But today, this webinar is all about kids and phones. So I have an 8-year-old daughter. Her name is Lulu. She asks me regularly for a phone. I say no regularly to a phone. She wants to know why she can't have a phone. I wish I had better explanations besides, I think you're too young. It feels like I don't have a great relationship with my phone, and I don't know how to model that for you. So today we're going to talk about all of these things. We're going to answer all of the amazing questions that you submitted when you signed up for this webinar. We're going to get to as many as we can. And we have these amazing experts here to help us answer them. So let's get to know them. We have Dr. Devorah Heitner here. She's the author of 2 amazing books, Growing Up in Public, Coming of Age in a Digital World, and Screenwise, both excellent places to start learning more about kids and screens. She has a PhD from Northwestern University. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and on CNN. Welcome, Devorah. So glad you're here.
Thank you.
And then we have Jacqueline Nisi. She has a PhD in clinical psychology. Her research focuses on the role tech plays in young people's mental health. She's also an assistant professor at Brown University, co-founder of Tech Without Stress, which offers online resources and courses for parents. And she publishes the popular newsletter, Techno Sapiens. So hi, Jacqueline, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And lastly, we have digital media wellness educator Julia Storm. She's a writer, teacher, public speaker, and the founder of Reconnect. That's an organization offering classes for parents looking to navigate the tricky world of teen, tweens, and tech. She received her BA from Princeton University and earned a master's degree from UCLA's School of Film, Television, and Digital Media. Prior to launching Reconnect, Julia worked in the film and television industry for 15 years. Hi, Julia.
Hi.
So we are so glad you are all here, and all of you are parents as well. So let's start with sort of a fun question. Let's tell us about your kids. Tell us how old they are and a parenting win you've had this summer. So let's start with Jacqueline.
Sure. So my kids are young. They're certainly too young for a smartphone or social media. I have a son who is 3 and a son who is 10 months old. And let's see, a win for the summer. This is very indicative of their ages, but a win for the summer for us is I found reusable water balloons. Has anyone ever used those?
Yeah,
Seen
that's
those?
awesome.
They're basically these little rubbery things that you can fill up with water and then throw them, and then you can fill them up again. And they have entertained my 3-year-old for hours on end. So a great find.
That's the best. Excellent work. How about
Yeah.
you, Devorah?
Well, I have a 10th grader who is just back at school this week because we start really early in the Midwest. And he is 15, and I've been teaching him to drive. And I just wrote about it in my newsletter this week, but it's terrifying. It's bringing back a lot of traumatic memories of my parents teaching me to drive. I think I learned a few new words from both of them at the time. I think my kid's a little ahead of me there. And it's also been kind of great, though. It's been like time together, actually, because it's like time that he's like anxious to spend an hour with me. It's unplugged time, right? Where neither of us is on our phones. So it's kind of great, but also terrifying.
Well, congratulations. That's a huge accomplishment. And how about you, Julia?
I have 2 sons, a going into 9th grader and a 7th grader. And I would say this was an interesting summer because it was my first summer with like a proper teenager in the house, and really experiencing actually the pull of the screen for a teenager when they're not scheduled. So that was really interesting, but that's kind of an aside. In terms of wins, I think my younger son, over the course of the summer, I watched him really kind of understand that time is limited and sort of fleeting. And yesterday in the car, he actually said to me out of nowhere, I'm just realizing I only have a limited amount of time on this planet. And I really have to think about how I want to spend it. And to me, that was like, okay, he's using, he's really thinking, being conscious about that push and pull, online, offline pull, and how do I want to spend my time. And that felt really good that it also felt good that he was just spacing out, looking out the window in the car and just came up with that thought. So that felt good.
That is really great. Well, I know we have a lot of people here watching and we want to get to their questions, so we're going to start. We got hundreds of questions for this webinar, but a one that came up a lot is the basic one, which is, what age should my kid get a phone? And I'm just going to start with a yes or no question for you, wonderful experts. Is there a clear age in your mind that you would answer to this question? So let's say, Dvora, would you say yes or no that there's a clear age that you can just say?
I think it's a developmental set of milestones. And I also think that it's really important not to think of the phone as an all or nothing. You don't need to go from like no device to here's a fully loaded latest model smartphone that does all the things and you can have all the apps and have all the contacts and have it 24/7. So I think it's both not a yes, no kind of binary in terms of like what the actual next device is. And I think it's really important not to think in terms of birthdays, but to think in terms of your kids and your family situation. Like, is your kid going to be home alone, for example, and you don't have a house phone? Is there another solution that would work for that if you don't want to get your kid a phone for that? There are multiple situations that might prompt you to think your kid needs another communication device, and it's worth thinking about where they're at developmentally.
Very good. How about you, Jacqueline? How would you answer the question, is there an age where a kid should get a phone?
No. Yeah. I would say, no, I would, yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Deborah said. I don't think there is one right age. I think there can be a right age for you and for your family and your child, and depending on your needs and their needs and where they are developmentally, as Deborah said, but I don't think there's one right age. Unfortunately, it would be a lot easier if there was just one right age that we could point to.
Yeah, that would be nice. Julia, are you in agreement, or do you have
Yes,
different
I
thoughts on
agree.
this?
And this is probably the question I get most every time I do a parenting workshop. And my answer usually to parents is wait as long as you can for your family. I do think that kids do hit those milestones that Devora is talking about at different ages, but there's a real big difference between like a 14-year-old brain and a 9-year-old brain, and understanding that if you are capable of putting it off until there's a need, not just a want, then that's the way to think about it.
That makes a lot of sense. So another question we got a lot of, our parents want to know what the dangers are when it comes to phones. So I'm going to start with this first question is, are there long-term effects for kids who use phones? I know, Jacqueline and Dvora and Julia, you've all looked at a lot of research. Let's start with you, Jacqueline. What do we know about long-term effects?
I mean, I think what we know about the effects of phones on just well-being generally is that it really depends on how the phones are being used and who the kids are. So there's a fancy name for this in the research, which is differential susceptibility to media effects. But what that basically means is that there's a lot of different things we can be doing on our phones, some of which are going to be better and some of which are going to be worse. And kids are very different from each other. So the same experience on a phone for one kid is going to impact them very differently than another kid. And I think that, what we hear so often when we're talking about phones and kids is so often we hear phones are bad, just sort of full stop, or phones are bad for you, phones are bad for them. But what the research would say is really a more nuanced thing, which is that it really depends on how they're used and who kids are before they start using them.
So, does it say anything about what kind of activities might have more, might impact a kid more than other activities?
Yeah.
Jacqueline, go ahead.
Do you want me to jump in or
Yeah,
should
go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that, when we think about risks of some of these technologies, phones, social media, being one thing that's accessed frequently on devices, I think the risks that we really think about are content related. So what are they looking at? What are they seeing? Conduct related, like what are they doing on there? And then, how much time they're spending. Like if it's getting in the way of other things that are really important for their well-being, like sleep, then that's also, going to be problematic. So those are, I think, the areas to be thinking about risk. But of course, there are benefits. So if kids are using the devices to connect with friends, to make connections with friends or family, to be creative, to create, to explore their identities. All of these things, I think, can be benefits of these technologies. So, yeah, I'll stop there and let others jump in too.
Yeah, Dora or Julia, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I agree with all of that. And I would also say the piece that doesn't get talked about that much is that because kids sort of, once they become teenagers, especially, their entire lives are kind of nested in the phone, right? So like their music, their friends, their interests, everything is on this little device. And so it makes sense that it sort of becomes like an appendage to them. But what I try to think about is, what is it replacing? Right. So are you not doing other things? Are you not, taking the time to reflect? Because instead of taking the time to reflect, you're picking up a phone, right? So, where is the phone kind of taking the place of these moments for growth or for self reflection that kids really need? That's where I start to think about, is this unhealthy for a child or not? But again, the phone, not all screen time is equal. Unfortunately, when you see your kid on a phone, it looks the same to us no matter what they're doing, right? But there are times when I'll say to my older son, hey, I feel like you've been on there a really long time. Maybe you want to put that down for a minute and like take a walk around the house. And you'll be like, I'm literally listening to music and talking to my friends, And then I go, okay, there's no way for me to know that. So that
Mm-hmm.
can, I think, raise a little bit of anxiety in parents, is that like we don't really know what's happening there. And so it can
Mm-hmm.
feel like the phone itself is the problem. So yeah.
And it tends to come into kids' lives at a time when developmentally they're shifting to peer socialization as being really primary, and they might not come home and give you the full download about their day the way they maybe did in third grade. You might not get that download in eighth grade in the same way, like, this happened and then this happened and this is what's going on. There might be more, kind of self, some boundaries coming in. And I think sometimes parents associate that with the phone, like, oh, my kid isn't telling me everything because they're on this phone. But if you think about yourself and your journey in middle school and high school, you probably also were choosing different ways of interacting with parents and having different boundaries and a different focus on peers versus the family at home. And so it's important to remember that this is, kind of amplifying what else is going on. So if your kid is struggling socially, for example, the phone may appear to amplify what's going on, but it's rare that I've just even anecdotally or qualitatively in the research seen situations where the phone introduces a problem that just wasn't there at all. It's more likely to amplify what's going on. So if your kid is in between friend groups and then they're looking at Snapchat maps and they see where everybody is, that could be a real experience of feeling left out, but it's probably amplifying, right? And I mean, I think it's really problematic, but it's amplifying what's already going on. It's not
Sure.
introducing a whole new set of problems. And if your kid is using his or her phone to communicate with the same three friends that they've been friends with for the last year or 5 years, and that's a pretty nice dynamic, it's unlikely that the texting is suddenly going to introduce a horrendous dynamic between those same kids.
Sure.
Right. So it's really important to see the phone as amplifying or kind of sometimes intensifying what's already going on.
So I have a follow-up question to something you said earlier, Devorah, when you were talking about what the age might be for a kid to have a phone. This is from Kate, she wants to know, can you elaborate on what developmentally ready looks like? How do you know if your kid is developmentally ready?
You want to look at both their ability to keep track of physical stuff, right? Like how likely are they to do their laundry with this thing in the pocket? How likely are they to lose it, smash it? And you might decide, like some of us in our family are likely to lose and smash phones and we still have them, including me. I have replaced my screen a few times this year. But you have to kind of think about, like, am I ready to budget for that? And then look at your kids socially. How impulsive are they? Are they likely to say something that's going to blow up a friendship? Are they likely to pass on information that's not theirs to share? And these are problems we could look at for adults relating via texting and social media as well. Am I always passing things on with the best of intentions? Am I reacting or responding? So I think it's really important to expect some challenges with kids and phones too. Like whenever your kid gets a phone at whatever age, there's going to be some challenges and bumps in the road. It's not going to go perfectly. But I would really look at, if you know your kid has a really hard time owning their actions or being accountable for their behavior, you might want to have a very limited relationship. Like maybe they need to, have access to the Remind app for a team they're on. Maybe put that on your phone for the first few months. Maybe they're not ready.
Mm-hmm. And here's a question for you, Julia, from Kate. So how can we explain to a 9-year-old maybe who's asking, can I please have a phone? Can I please have a phone? I want to be on Instagram. How do we explain to that 9-year-old why we don't want you to have a phone? What some of the things that we're worried about, what some of the dangers are?
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely gone through this in the last year with my middle schooler who desperately wants a phone. And, I think the first thing is to empathize. I think it can be really hard for kids to feel like everyone around them has a phone and they don't. And you do feel, it's a signifier. So you do feel like, everyone else is sort of signifying something that you can't signify. And in their minds, a lot of time that's like maturity or coolness. So, for me, I think it's very important to first empathize and connect and understand, yeah, this is really tricky. This is challenging. And then talk about, I always advise the same thing Devorah is saying is like, let's look at A, do we need it? B, are you ready for it? Right. And, let's really look at the why of this. Are you ready for it? And why do we want it? And then have a conversation. I'm very pro conversations around all of this stuff to help kids to process and think about, how this technology fits into their life. It can't just be about us saying like, no, I just don't think you're ready. I think nine's too young. Is like have the conversation so that there's a why behind it. And I think you can point to, listen, it may seem like a phone is just, some everyday object that everybody has, but actually the phone is probably the most powerful piece of technology to come around in the past 15 years. And has access to the entire world in your pocket. And that can bring a lot of stress, to your life. And I don't know if I want to bring that stress into your life. Now, if you feel as a parent like, okay, actually, my kid has a point. They're after school alone a lot. They want to be able to get in touch with me. Then maybe we talk about, are there other options? Because I'm not comfortable yet with giving you the full-blown phone. So let's look at what some of our other options are to kind of bridge this uncomfortable gap between having nothing and then having to wait to have the phone. And there are options, and maybe we'll talk about that afterwards.
Right. Jacqueline or Devorah, anything you'd like to add to that question of how to tell your kid why you don't want them to have a phone right now?
No, I mean, I think that's such a good answer. I was gonna just emphasize the why piece, like the really trying to understand why it is that they want a phone, because I think that really then guides that guides what you do. If the why is, like you said, is something about wanting to get picked up, coordinate pickup, then that's one thing. If the why is that they're feeling left out socially because their friends, I don't know about at age 9, but maybe their friends are communicating via phones, then that's also something to consider. Is there a way that you can help them feel more socially connected without getting the phone if you're not ready for it? So just, yeah, I think asking questions.
Yeah, and I think thinking about skills that your kid might need to navigate a situation where either they don't have a phone or a watch and they feel like they sort of need one in that moment, like you weren't there at the exact moment. And I mean, those of us who grew up in the old days of, the 90s, 80s, or 70s spent a lot of time waiting around and not exactly knowing when we were going to get picked up and had to deal with that ambiguity. So teaching your kids some tricks, like, and at what, like giving them a sense of like, if I'm 5 minutes late, maybe you don't have to freak out. If I'm an hour late, like, yeah, maybe like see if you can get someone at school to call home and see if like we got our signals crossed on which parent was getting you, or, right, like kind of talk to them about like, if A, then B. And also, I think a lot of parents are getting kids phones at ages like 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 because of their own anxiety and wanting to track their kids and wanting to be able to reach their kids. And so if that's the case, and you think developmentally it might be better to wait, but you feel anxious because you're running late and you want to be able to reach out, or had that one time when you were at the soccer field and there were 10 games going and you couldn't find your kid for an uncomfortable amount of time. Those are situations to kind of think about in advance and think about, how can I deal with my anxiety as an adult? And maybe I can turn down the dial on that, or, wait until I've had more than one of those situations. I don't think we need to like run and get our kid, a smartphone the first time you have a communication miss and there's a little bit of discomfort, right? We want to kind of build our ability to deal with all of that.
That's
Yeah,
really
I
good
would
advice.
really want to just chime in and put a like emphasis on what Devora just said. I do feel like, I'm with parents all the time talking to them about this stuff. And I would say at least 50% of them are the ones who are scared to not be able to get in touch with their child.
Mm,
And that's something that's sort of endemic in parenting culture right now. And, we've all probably at this point read Anxious Generation, and we know instinctively too that there's something not great for our kids about us feeling like we need to have a hold on them every single second, that they're somehow not
mm-hmm.
capable of handling life without us being reachable or them being, able to contact us.
So the parents have to do some work on ourselves to let go of some of that, it sounds like. Um, Here's another good question from our listeners today. So you kind of hinted at this, Julia. There are some alternatives to smartphones. If you don't have a landline and you want a way for your kid to get in touch with you when they're home, what are some of the alternatives you've seen that you think are good for kids if they want to start gaining some independence? Who would like to take that one? Julia, want to start?
Sure, I can start. So there are many phones right now on the market that actually are smartphones, but they have operating systems that were created for kids. And there's quite a few options out there. Off the top of my head, I can think of the Pinwheel phone, the Gab phone, the Bark phone, and these phones basically allow for everything but the stuff that parents are scared of, right? So, it's not going to have web access, and it's not going to have social media access and games and stuff like that, but it's going to have ability to communicate and to take photographs and videos and that kind of stuff. So, for the younger kids, that could be a good option. Then there's the option of smartwatches. So smartwatches often can make a really good bridge. There's more sophisticated ones if your kids may be a little bit older and better able to take care of their stuff, or they want to have something that has a little bit of like, panache to it. And then there's more simple ones for younger kids, just so that you can have 10 contacts on there and be able to know where they are, and that's that. And then lastly, I mean, most younger kids are not going to want a flip phone. Interestingly, I don't know, Devora and Jacqueline, if you've seen this, but some older teenagers and young adults are actually kind of dabbling in getting flip phones now, because they kind of want a break from their smartphone. So it's almost starting to become a little trendy. But I found that the younger kids are still very averse to that idea. So I mean, those tend to be, did I miss anything? Maybe the others have something to chime in on that.
I would just say that if a kid has grown up with tablets, it's very hard to go away from the touch screen towards something where you have to hit a letter multiple, a number multiple times to get a letter. Like that is pretty annoying. If you grew up with an iPad in your hand and then you're 12 years old and someone hands you something where like to get the letter C, you have to hit a number 3 times, like I'm going to say that that's a pretty frustrating way to communicate. And so I may have experimented with a little bit in my house at one point with a flip phone, and I just got this like, what is this junk, And I think that's an understandable response. But I think for the adults who want to intentionally slow down, who want to text less, who don't want to be on social media, I totally get it. And I think the market, frankly, is too limited. Like the sort of starter baby phones, they're because all of the providers have us all sort of locked into these family plans. I think a lot of people do just give their kids their hand-me-down phone because they're already in a plan. And sometimes when you're in a plan, it's a little bit more work to go with some kind of starter phone where maybe you need a different plan for it. And I recognize that as a big challenge. I think it's more important to think about what they will do on whatever device they have in terms of like who will be the contacts, what's the procedure for using the app store. I wouldn't rely, we haven't gotten to parental controls, but I wouldn't rely on those solely as your plan. They're very, very limited in their ability. And I think parents can sometimes over rely on those or imagine that they're doing kind of more heavy lifting than they're doing. That said, just thinking about who your kid can contact on the device is huge, right? Because think about your own experience with your phone. If you have stress on your phone, it's probably from someone you were in contact with, that you're communicating with, or someone who posted something that really did not hit you well, right? And so if you're limiting that universe, you're limiting that impact.
So if parental controls, we've had some questions about this, if those are not a great thing to rely on, what is the best way to make sure we know what our kids are doing on their phones or their baby phones or their flip phones or their watches, whatever device they're on? What's a good way for parents to control that or limit it or watch it? Jacqueline, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, and I'm curious if others agree, but I think parental control can definitely be a good option for some families. Like, I don't think just because they're not foolproof doesn't mean that they shouldn't be used. I just think they shouldn't be used alone. Like I definitely think that they can be useful, and there's lots of options for the types of parental controls that can be set, both, at the device level, at the level of different apps, at the level of the Wi-Fi in some cases. Like there's lots of options, but they'll never get you all the way there, I think. I think so. The place I would start with this, which sounds very obvious, but sometimes we forget, is with conversation. I think asking what kids are up to on their devices is probably the best way to learn. And that can look, I think, a lot of different ways. So it may be, just asking lots of questions. Maybe you have them give you a little tour of what they're up to on their device, of different apps, how they're using them, why they like them, who they're talking to. I think there's a lot of options, but I would say to start having conversations about it.
Julia, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that a lot of parents feel that they've sort of been put into a position where they need to be the bad cop. And, creating an adversarial relationship to the tech and to your kid is not going to serve you or your child. It's going to create a rift. And as they get older, they are going to make mistakes online. And you want to have established a relationship to them and to their online world where they will come to you, right? And they will talk to you. And if they think that you're always saying what you do on there is silly or dumb, or I don't get it, or get off of there, then you're not the person they're going to come share with. And so I've made it a practice in my home, and I try to encourage parents to really step into the role of ally, which I think is what Jacqueline was saying, is like, go find out, get curious, ask them about their world, like say yes sometimes, try to step into their shoes, because the more you can do that, not only are you learning, and you'll be surprised sometimes at the stuff that you thought you wouldn't enjoy or wouldn't get, but you do, but also I think it gives you more of a leg to stand on when you do need to set a boundary and when you do need to say no. Because if you know how it is as a parent, it's like if everything's like, that's dumb, or no, absolutely not, then it just loses its power, right? That no is like means nothing. So stepping in as an ally, I think just creates better channels of communication with kids. Yeah, so that's kind of the position that I try to encourage parents to take.
What about you, Devora? How to
Yeah, I think I
monitor?
agree
Yeah.
with both Jacqueline and Julia on everything you're both saying. And I mean, I think Julia, absolutely, you want to pick your battles and fight to win. And maybe you think like watching squirrels fall off of stuff on YouTube is not like the highest and best use of your kid's time, but like porn is an absolute no. And
Exactly.
like, is harmful, has effects you don't want. And so you're gonna choose, right? And like all the way over here would be like something creative on where we're creating content and things, or mashing things up that they found, right? And so maybe if we have a hierarchy, we're thinking about like creativity versus consumption, but consumption is, could be anything from like reading a book on your Kindle, or, listening to a really great podcast like Brains On, or it could be, something you're not as excited about. And so you really want to pick your battles and especially think about the content you consumed again as a kid and like, you know, maybe like Bugs Bunny wasn't like the highest and best use of your time, but it didn't like wreck you. But are there things that you saw that were traumatic? Like I was left home during the day to see some very scary and troubling things that I wish I hadn't seen. So I think it's important to really decide where you're going to make that line in the sand. And to come back to parental controls, I absolutely agree with Jacqueline that they can be really useful, but I'm going to say, especially in the single digit ages, I think once you get to the double digit ages, kids can go on YouTube and see how to hop over the parental controls. So if you are like setting up an 11, 12, 13-year-old with a new device, again, parental controls can have a role, but I would be very modest in my expectations. And I'm still a huge fan. I have a 15-year-old. I still take his phone at night.
Yep.
This may be the year where we stop doing that, actually. Like we're moving in that direction probably because I do want him to have practice with self-regulating. But I do think in middle school and early high school, I mean, you can do all the things in the world to try to shut your kid's phone access at night, but like taking it away, very effective. And certainly for little kids, there's really no reason I can think of where like a 6th or 7th grader would need to have a connected device access overnight or where that would benefit them. And the risks of, loss of sleep so outweigh the potential benefits that it's definitely worth thinking. And that's a very old school method that no matter how tech savvy you are or aren't, you can manage.
Yeah, and I would just really quickly also add that I think there's a little bit of a difference between setting some controls and monitoring. Like those are two really different things. And I think it's perfectly acceptable and you should set up some guardrails, right, for your kids at different ages that are age appropriate because you don't want them seeing certain things and you don't want them spending 4 hours because you didn't realize, right? And as they get older, I still use certain controls with my kids, with my older son, but like even yesterday, he wanted to, I don't remember what, access something. And I said, well, how much time feels reasonable to you in a day to spend on this app? And we talked about it, right? And he didn't say some outlandish. He wasn't like 3 hours. He thought like maybe 30 or 40 minutes. And I said, okay, that seems good. Is that a good limit to set? Yes. Right. So we work together because I'm trying to teach him like, this is about your well-being. So think about how much you need of this in a day, and then let's set that limit together. And that's really different than monitoring your kids and watching every single thing they're doing and seeing all their messages and where are they. That really can start to bring on a lot of anxiety for the parent, I think, and make the kid feel like, God, you really don't trust me at all to do anything on my own.
Excellent advice. I'm just going to pause for 1 second to just say thank you to all of our subscribers out there who make this event possible. Those are our sort of Smarty Pass subscribers, so thank you for making webinars like this possible through your support. If you want to join Smarty Pass, you can get ad-free episodes and bonus stuff. And right now you can get 10% off with the code ANALOG. Just go to smartypass.org. Thank you for letting me say that. Now we're going to go back to all these amazing questions. So here is a great one. So a lot of people are asking about neurodivergent kids, who have autism or ADHD. One parent said that neurodivergent kids sometimes use screens to self-regulate. Is there any helpful guidance for parents of neurodiverse kids? Devorah, do you want to start?
I just want to quickly put in a plug for
Yeah.
Meryl Alper's new book, Kids Across the Spectrum, which is just an awesome, very accessible book. It is an academic book with research in it, but it's very accessible. And I think if you're raising a kid, particularly a kid on the spectrum, or a kid who identifies as neurodiverse, I think it would be a good read. I also think it's really important to think about the accessibility of these devices and how much they promote accessibility. And I wrote a piece about my late mom who had probably a nonverbal learning disability, wasn't diagnosed, but had a very hard time in school and in work and in life with various tasks that were kind of had like the sort of the hallmark of an LD, which is like very uneven kinds of experiences. And I think a phone would have changed her life so much because she specifically struggled so much with wayfinding and spelling. And she didn't come of age in a world with spell check. So we take some of these things for granted that we have, like spell check. My mother never could see a future for herself in a job where she had to write things or spell things. And I feel like spelling is not completely an obsolete skill. I'm sure there's still people getting blue ribbons for spelling bees out there, but spell check has really changed how important it is for us to have that skill naturally. And same thing with wayfinding, like having Google Maps, would have changed her life. So I just think it's really important to think of, there are a lot of downsides. Sometimes people worry about, I wrote a lot about growing up in public about kids like sharing about their neurodiversity online. People really worry about kids disclosing about their differences and the stigma they might face. And I actually talked to Jacqueline for that chapter, so I want to let her chime in too. But I think it's really important to think about the upsides of building community and affinity in these spaces as well for our kids. So it's complicated. And I think families raising neurodiverse kids are in a situation where they don't get to take anything sort of for granted. They're always going to have to think extra hard about all these decisions.
Yeah, Jacqueline, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. I think that can be especially challenging for families in this situation. A lot of times the sort of standard advice feels like it doesn't apply to them. But at the same time, of course, all neurodiverse kids are different. So what works for one kid is going to be the opposite for another kid. What's really helpful for one kid is going to be really hurtful for another kid, or really challenging for another kid. So I think there's a little bit of trial and error here with figuring out what works for them. I think it's worth being aware that it can be more challenging for kids with certain conditions, like kids who are on the spectrum, kids with ADHD. It can be more challenging to put down devices. Sometimes that's because it's very helpful for them for regulating. Sometimes not, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that that may be sort of an extra challenge that these kids run into.
Here's another good question, and there's a few things like, do you have any advice about getting your community on board with everyone waiting to give kids phones until the same age, like the wait till 8 movement or other things like that? What advice do you have? Do you think that's something people should try to do? I'll start with you, Julia.
Yes, I think it's great. I think there's a lot of power in numbers. I've personally had the experience of being invited into, I don't know, a school setting, doing a parent ed, and then the parents feel like, okay, like now that we've all been here and we've heard this, let's band together and do something. And that seems to work best with parents of younger kids, right? Like once you get to middle school, it gets a little tricky to, first of all, parents don't tend to be as like cohesive as a body as like, at a school once they get to that age. And also there's a feeling of like the train has left the station. But I've seen with parents of elementary school kids for sure coming together, whether it's the wait till 8th pledge, which is really useful, which basically is just getting a group together to agree to wait till 8th grade to get a phone for their kids. There's real strength in numbers. I think I go to some schools where I visit I don't know, parents of a 6th grade class, and 80% of the kids have phones. And so then the other 20% are like, they feel so left out, right? And then I'll go to another school and it's like only 25% of the kids have phones, and it's kind of a non-issue for the other kids because they have enough people around them who are in the same boat as them and they don't have to think about it. So I do think this is the kind of situation where when you get a group together, when you get your peers together, your kids' friends, together to agree, it can be really helpful. Now, is that easy to do? No. I mean, it takes initiative. It takes, the parents who feel really strongly about it and say, hey, we want to do this. And at that point, I've seen it happen. You just send out a letter and you say who's on board and you get the ball rolling.
And then there's another push too to get phones out of schools altogether. I'm just wondering if Devorah or Jacqueline, if you've seen any research about what it would do to get phones out of schools.
Well, teachers definitely
Jacqueline, you
are
wanna take this one?
struggling. Or yeah, Jacqueline, why don't you?
Oh, no, you go ahead. Go ahead.
I would say teachers definitely are struggling with phones, but there's also Chromebooks and iPads. And I'm really concerned about any approach that's not holistic, that's not student-centered. When people say, for example, this is what we're doing for student wellness, I'm like, well, have you asked the kids, what about giving more recess? What about, not doing silent lunches? If we're worried about kids' social skills, I think there's proactive things we can do that are not reactive and that are not punitive. I'm also a little bit nervous about the sort of wait until 8th or the wait until high school or wait until 16. Some of those ideas I think are repressive. And I think I think families need to be trusted to make their own decisions. I mean, that said, Julia, I see what you're saying too about the kids being left out. And so I think communities need to do a lot to make sure there's spaces for kids. There should be spaces at the library. There should be places at the skate park. There should be bike trails for kids. Like what we want is for places for kids to be and be together that are safe and that don't cost money. I think that's really important. But I think it can be really hard. I mean, where I live, there's 72 languages spoken in my school district. So like getting all the parents together to like chat about something is not always a kind of a reality or the idea that every family's needs are similar. If you have a kid who's doing sibling care after school, that kid may need a phone in a different way than a kid who's going to an aftercare program or has a nanny or whose parents are home. So I just think it's important that every family to acknowledge that every family is different. But I absolutely also see the idea of getting some uniformity is really attractive because we all grew up with like the idea of like you don't call people after 10, for example, or some, maybe some families it was 9, some families it was 10. There was some idea of there was a time after which you didn't call. And I think we are struggling right now as a society because there seem to be no clear rules about communication, about when to get kids a phone. So I recognize that desire for like getting everyone on the same page. I just think it's challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Jacqueline,
I think I'll just add. I think some of what was said in both of these. I think there's a tendency, or maybe a focus should be sort of on not just subtracting, but adding. Like not just like let's take away the phones or let's make sure they don't get phones, but like what else do you want to be in place? Like why are we doing this? And what else can we give kids that's meeting the needs that right now they're meeting through their devices? So in many cases that might be more opportunities to spend time together in sort of independent ways. And I think that is also important to keep in mind.
And I'm wondering, so for parents who feel really confused about how to answer this question to their kid who wants a phone, or they've already given their kid a phone and they're nervous about it, are there, research you've seen that sort of informs the way you look at this? Like if you could give a couple examples of research, because I know there's a lot of worry and stuff that's not necessarily based in research. So Jacqueline, do you have maybe an example of some research you've seen that sort of grounds the way you think about this?
Just generally, or
Yeah, just maybe an example of some studies that you think would be useful for parents to know about that, maybe surprised you or just think could help inform parents as they're trying to make these decisions. And if you don't have one off the top of your head, we can come back to it. Devorah, do you have any that come to mind? Any pieces of information that would be useful to parents as they're making these decisions?
There's some good research calling into question the the sort of constant headlines that teens are in crisis. And actually Jacqueline's newsletter, her Substack, is really good on kind of taking apart some of what feels like this sort of common wisdom where everyone's saying teens are in crisis and it's the phones, and really saying, okay, what aspects of phones, but also, are teens actually universally in crisis? Is this really going on? Are we just talking about mental health in new ways? So there's some really interesting research that might be reassuring to parents.
Excellent. Yeah, Jacqueline, do you have anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm struggling to think of particular studies that I feel like are relevant here. I mean, the things that are coming to mind are what I said before about sort of different effects. So the idea that this is not a uniform experience across all kids and all technologies. The other thing that I'm thinking about is research on parents' use of devices. So I don't know if we've really talked about this yet, but
No.
yeah, I mean, so there's a fair amount of research that the way that as parents that we use our devices has an impact on the way our kids use their devices. And that's true both. I think parents' device use matters both in terms of modeling. So like, what are we showing our kids? What are they seeing? But also in terms of what in the research is called technoference, basically just when technology is interfering with our interactions with our kids. I think that kids, especially as they get into the teen years, are very attuned to hypocrisy of any kind. So if we are asking our kids to use their devices in a certain way or put them down at certain times, I think we really need to be aware of how we are using them too. And I think that's very much supported by the research.
That is great advice. So for those parents out there, myself included, what advice do you have for having a good relationship with your phone to model for your kids? Who would like to start? Julia, do you want to start?
Sure. I think it's about really being intentional um, with our technology and, you know, figuring out what are values. I think a lot of these decisions for adults and for kids can be kind of values based decisions when it comes to technology. It's like if I value, you know, eating a delicious meal and really savoring the flavors, then spending my time staring at a screen while I'm eating is in direct conflict with that value, right? If I value having time to sit face to face with somebody and really hear them and have them really hear me, then picking up my phone in the middle of that conversation is in conflict with my value. So I really value sleep. I think it's very, very important for my mental health and my physical health. So I'm not going to let my technology interfere with making sure I get the sleep I need. So I think if we think about it that way, then we can kind of be intentional about this is a moment where my technology is of value to me and I'm using it in a way that is aligned with my needs and my wants. And that's what I'm modeling to my kid. If I'm using it in a way that's, you know, causing me to ignore my kids, to run away from my difficult feelings, to whatever, you know, numb myself out, then there's a problem there, and my kids are seeing that, and what they see from me is, you know, we're their first role models, and even when you feel like they're not watching, they're watching, and they're sort of by osmosis, right, taking all that stuff in. So that's how I approach it and how I, you know, try to talk to parents about it.
Jacqueline or Dvor, anything you'd like to add?
Well, I go to schools and work with kids, and I'll ask them to brainstorm about problems that devices can cause with friends or parents. And then I have them invent apps to solve it. And they often invent an app that gets parents off their phones because their parents roll into pickup on the phone. And in addition to the safety hazard and the terrible modeling of the driving and texting, they'll also say like, oh, how did it go in Spanish? And then they'll ask their kid again because they're not really listening to the answer. And kids really, really don't like it. And if you don't want to, and I'm really like, I'm at the age where it could come home to roost, you know, and you think about like the sort of 80s anti-drug commercial. I learned it from you, Mom. I am at the age where like, if I see my kid sort of phubbing me or God forbid texting and driving, I'd have to be like, oh my gosh, did I did I teach him this by doing it in front of him?
Mhm.
So it does, and I think if you're very brave, you can ask your kid what is their least favorite tech habit of yours. I would not do that if you're having
Mm.
a hard time. That's like you're in a
Yeah.
good place question, because you need to be ready to hear the answer.
Excellent advice. Yeah, Jacqueline, what do you think?
I was just going to point out in thinking about values around tech, I think somebody might have put this in the chat, but I was able to contribute to this resource that I think is really helpful with in collaboration with the Center for Digital Thriving at Harvard and Common Sense Media. And it's basically this value sort exercise. There's like some worksheets and stuff, and there's a version for schools and a version for parents with kids. And the idea is basically just thinking through, both for you and your child, like what are the values that are important to you, and then thinking about how tech either helps or harms those values. And I think it can be at least a good springboard for conversations about this.
Excellent. So yeah, so as parents, we need to watch ourselves for sure. Here's another question from a listener. How do I get my kid off the phone? So time limits, bribery. What is your advice? How do you get kids off the phone? Let's start with you, Dora.
I think it's really important, ideally, to kind of plan your day and your life. And I love the conversation Julia described, with her son, of like thinking together about what the limits should be, and thinking also what else. And I think we all have talked about this. What else you want to create time for, right? If you know you want to have time to practice your lines for the play, and need time to sleep, and you want some time to hang out with your pet face to face and snuggle, like what's left. And for most of our kids, there's not a lot, especially on weekdays, like there's not a ton of downtime during the school year, right? And so like I'm in that shift. We went back to school this week from summer screen time to school year screen time, and it's looking real different. So I just think it's important to plan. And then also, it's depending on your kid's age, you may be ready to let them experience some natural consequences of not limiting. So like what happens if you watch the next episode and the next episode on YouTube or on Netflix, and you don't shift to what else you need to do? And as a parent, it can be uncomfortable, but can you let your kid experience the downsides of not regulating? Or are you going to regulate for them until they get out the door? And having taught college for many years, I will say that the downside of that is then they get to college and they stay up all night and play World of Warcraft or whatever kids are playing now. You could tell I left the classroom a while ago. I don't know if kids are still playing that, but like they could not self-regulate. And I think sometimes, mom or dad was making them still brush their teeth until they turned 18.
Jacqueline, what do you think? Any advice for how to get kids off the phones?
No, I think those are the two things I would point to, which are, first, be thinking about what else you want them doing instead. So not just less phone use, but more of something else, whatever it is that's important to you and to them. And then doing it collaboratively. So really thinking through, I think getting specific about times when they or you are wanting to use the phone less is important. I think having this, these general conversations about like, you're using your phone too much, or you need to use your phone less, is going to be a lot less effective than, let's try to make sure that during dinner we're putting our devices away, that kind of thing. So getting a little more specific, I think, too, and involving kids, of course, in that conversation.
What do you think, Julia?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to add, just from a personal anecdote. We were talking earlier about kids. I have a son who has ADHD, and it's hard. I mean, I'm just going to speak personally. Like he is both almost 15 and has ADHD. And for kids like that, and just to empathize with any parents who are going through this, like it can be extra, extra hard to get them off the phone, because there is a comfort to it. There's this dopamine thing that they're craving, right? That they're sort of needing this to self-regulate. And on top of that, I think for a lot of kids who are on this ADHD spectrum, it's sort of like it's a disorder of motivation, right? So it's hard for them often to motivate to do something else as well. And this is where I know I personally, as a mom, have struggled with him with the phone. And I know a lot of parents who go through that. And maybe your kid doesn't even need to have ADHD to go through that. But I do think that one of the things I've done with him is I've talked to him about the intersection between his ADHD and the device, right? And we talk about like why for him it may be a little harder to walk away. What's happening in your brain? Why is this so hard to get off of for you, right? So that he can kind of understand and track like, oh, what's the feeling I'm having right now? And why is it so hard to get off? And why can't I motivate to do something else? And that way he's sort of not to pathologize him, but so that he can have some, can self-reflect and say like, oh, this is intersecting in a way that may not be in my best interests. And so I try to kind of, for me, it's like, you want, like Devora said, like you want them to be able to leave your house and not just manage brushing their teeth, which I hope my child will shower more once he leaves my house, but also, being able to self-reflect and be like, this maybe is not the best for me. This isn't great for me. And I totally agree with Devora about like, natural consequences. It's really hard. I mean, I can't say that I've successfully allowed my child to fail yet because of those screens. I'm pretty much like trying to keep him on track. But I agree, like there will come a point where you just have to be like, all right, let's see what happens if you don't regulate yourself. So yeah, it really is a very, very tricky thing with teenagers with getting them to put those devices down.
Well, we are almost out of time. We're gonna end with a question of what are some screen-free ideas that you pitch to parents who are trying to unplug a little? Let's start with you, Jacqueline.
So for kids to unplug or for parents to unplug?
I think parents, yeah.
For kids. For kids, yeah. I mean, I think kids want to be social at the end of the day. In many cases, kids want to be with their friends. And I think oftentimes that's what devices are providing. And so I think some of the best screen-free activities are the ones where they can be with each other.
Nice. What do you think, Devora?
I think you can also take their screen-based interests. Like I have a kid who likes to play history strategy games, and so we turned him on to Risk and some other board games that are related to games like Hearts of Iron 4 that he was playing online. So it kind of came the other, in the other direction. Like I'm sure the people who designed Hearts of Iron 4 grew up playing Risk, or the people who designed Minecraft grew up playing with Legos, but you can also go the other direction from Minecraft to Legos.
And how about you, Julia?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on the age of your kids. Screen free looks really, really different for little kids than it does for teenagers. For little kids, there's a million and one things you can do. And actually, you can go on Pinterest and put in screen free activities, and lots of people have done the work for you. And they've come up with lists and lists and lists of really fun stuff to do with little kids. And then with older kids, I agree. I think it's a lot about letting them go hang out with friends. And then I also think it's about giving them opportunities to maybe stretch themselves in terms of independence. So I like the idea of like giving my son a list and being like, go to the grocery store, good luck, and letting him kind of experience what that's like. Or, I live in a city that public transportation isn't really a thing here, but like, can you figure out how to you want to see your friend? How will you get there? Right. And so just giving them these sort of like tasks that also feed, I think, their self-esteem a little bit, and the sense of like, I'm free, I'm independent, I can do things myself. I think that feels really good to older kids too.
And then the question we always end all of our interviews on, which is there anything else you want parents to know about this topic that we didn't get a chance to talk about today? I'm sure there's many things, but if there's one more that you would want to add that we didn't get a chance to talk about, do any of you have something you'd like to add?
I would cultivate relationships with parents of kids who are just a tiny bit older than your kid. To be like, what do you wish you knew before you greenlit Roblox or a phone or social media or anything like that? Just to not to scare yourself, and not to, when your kid is 5, talk to parents of 18-year-olds, because it's like too much almost. I mean, talk to them, but but just if you can kind of be in the conversation with more parents and in a supportive way, people who will just give you ideas and reflect on their experience without sort of necessarily telling you what to do or judging your choices. That can be really helpful. I think a lot of us have been sort of screen shamed out of talking to other parents about tech at all.
Excellent advice. Jacqueline or Julia, anything else we want to add that we didn't get a chance to talk about?
I mean, I would just say that, a lot of this stuff, like kids get older and they like figure it out. I would say like there's a long stretch in there where they're just like they're floundering. It's just about feeling good. It's just about connecting, and of course like this object is going to feed that. But I really see like the difference between like when I talk to eighth graders and when I talk to seniors, and it's not as if like the seniors know all this stuff, right? They know like this isn't good for me. I don't love to do this. I'm being manipulated by the algorithms. Like your kids are going to get to a point where they're going to understand all the mechanics behind all of this themselves. Like you won't have to be that brain for them. And they will have their journey, hopefully, to like figuring out that balance. So there also needs to be just, I think, a little bit of like, take it easy on yourself, like set those boundaries, be a role model, be their ally, and then understand that like this is their world. They're gonna figure it out.
Excellent advice. Jacqueline, anything
I
else
think
that you
that's
want to add that we
a
didn't?
good note to end on. Good note to end on.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, thank you all for listening today. We're going to post this. It'll be on our YouTube channel. It'll also be on brainson.org on our Analog August page. So if you have friends you want to share it to hear Devora and Julia and Jacqueline's great advice and thoughts, please do. And thank you, Jacqueline and Julia and Devora, for sharing all of that with us today. It was a delight to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye.